When more consciousness is felt within more individual, unique selves, then more wholeness is possible. When more wholeness is possible, then more meaningful participation is possible, both within that domain of one's own continued holding and healing of the individual self, but also within the domains of the human cultural systems and infrastructures, as well as within the domain of radical ecological stewardship and participation and regeneration and reanimation.
That we are arriving inside a continuity of being, a continuity of not only more than human being, of life's evolutionary process, but a continuity of a cultural being, right? Of a shared field of relationships between humans, how we have interacted with each other, our patterns and habits of behavior are shaping our very experience of every moment.
And so this honoring of these three domains of ourselves and the triplicity of ourselves allows an activation, a catalytic initiation of more evolutionary movement and engagement and participation in the growing of this home that is us and is our true nature, us being the totality of all that is. Welcome to the Seeds Podcast.
We are the School for Ecocentric Evolution and Design Strategies.
Our names are Alia
and Hayden,
and our primary mission is to sow seeds of a life-affirming world at the fertile intersection of the individual, cultural, and more than human ecologies.
We stand at a collective threshold. The old way of being cannot take us safely or meaningfully into the future.
A new way of being is asking to be born, which is both an embodied remembrance from our earth-based ancestry as well as an emergent possibility of a more beautiful future world.
We believe that this more beautiful world will arise out of a radical shift in collective consciousness, from an egocentric, separate self-reality to an ecocentric, life-sustaining one.
This shift in consciousness will not happen of its own making, but instead will require our active participation as a kind of collective rite of passage that not only changes how we see the world, but also how we choose to show up within it as members of it.
This transition is already taking place within the hearts and minds of so many individuals and communities around the world.
There are many who carry a similar vision, for it is not our vision alone, but instead it is the Earth's vision for herself that we are waking up to as conscious agents of her own evolutionary unfoldment.
It is a vision prayed for by our ancestors, and it is a vision remembered by the future ones to come.
We call this vision Seeds, and as the School for Ecocentric Evolution and Design Strategies, we are in service to studying and designing how we can most gracefully and holistically align with this evolutionary impulse that's organically arising in these unprecedented collective times.
Our intention with this podcast is to further refine, explore, and articulate this shared vision as an act of creative service to support this evolutionary transition.
May all our efforts and visions be woven together into a shared fabric of intention that can carry us safely and meaningfully from where we are now into the next chapter of our unfolding planetary story.
Thanks for being with us.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Seeds Podcast. This is our second episode in this series where we're going over some of our core design frameworks. Our last episode we talked about some of the foundations of Seeds, how Alia and I met, the backstory, what we've been working on, and sort of a broad overview of what's really guiding us forward, and what's informing us on a deep level, how we're understanding the nature of the times. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that one, I suggest you go back and listen to that one, as it can help frame the context for what we're going to be speaking about today.
So with this second episode, we're really beginning to look at how we understand the human being and how we understand the human being more specifically from an ecocentric lens.
Yep.
So we are talking about this, or we're thinking about this in terms of the foundational, irreducible domains of experience or of identity that comprise the human being's experience, its very existence, and also its continuance into the future. And so we call this the three identities that make up the human being, and we want to share this sort of very simple and yet also radically complex, infinitely complex way of understanding who and what we truly are.
Exactly. And what's really guiding us, just to touch back into this continually, is this collective maturational process towards an ecocentric, life-affirming, life-enhancing world. How can we really take the next steps in relationship to each other, in relationships to ourselves, in relationship with the more than human, in a way that can really lay the foundations for a life-affirming world? In the last episode, we kind of talked about the meta crisis that we're facing, and since that last episode, that's only continued to reveal itself. We have the banking crisis that's presenting itself collectively at this time, and we're just getting more and more, I think, collective awareness around the precarity of the moment and all of these expressions of vulnerability that are littered throughout our society. And so our work is really curious and really interested in how we participate with this evolutionary moment, which we see as a big transitional sort of liminal time between worlds. How we can design and structure our lives and our relationships in a way that can afford more wellness, more vitality, continuity of being, and evolution. And when we think about the meta crisis of this moment, what we're really talking about is a collective crisis of identity. Within the hearts of so many, there's this percolating of like, there can be something more beautiful, there can be something more attuned. And part of our framing around this is like, when we come to understand the nature of who we are, what actually allows for our very beingness to be, we can then participate with ourselves and with each other in a way that can really facilitate well-being across what we call our core domains or core facets of being.
Any good design needs to be based on a shared and accurate understanding of what is. Mm-hmm. And so really looking at the human being and wanting to take a view of understanding what really has comprised how we've come into being, and also what sustains or supports the possibility of our continued being over time.
Yep.
And so that's really the focus of this conversation today. And we're using the word identity and these different interlocking scales of identity because we really do feel that it's important in these times to not only from a kind of theoretical position say that yes, that facet of reality matters, but actually to feel our inherent kind of entanglement and part-ofness and membership within the different scales and the domains that we're going to be talking about today that deeply inform and affect and shape who and what we are at the human level.
Right, exactly. That they're, in a sense, right, when something seems just totally foreign or totally other than, we can fall prey to sort of manipulating that other, utilizing that other, harming that other, extracting from that other, because we don't see it as inherently interwoven within our own being, and that the quality of that other being's existence has no impact on the quality of my being, right? So what we're framing here is like, actually there's an interconnectedness of being and becoming and belonging across different domains or different scales of identity. And when we can begin to recognize ourselves and understand that the very nature of my being is informed by a multiplicity of relationships, and that the health of those relationships shape the health of my fundamental being, then we can begin to more accurately and effectively participate between these different domains of being and within life itself to support a quality of experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean that what inherently is right now is essentially wrong, but that actually is a signal coming from within our ontological, our felt experience of being that is revealing to us that there are greater possibilities of becoming. We are creating conditions of unwellness across multiple scales of being. And we're going to get into those specific scales, and it's going to make more sense as we go. We're identifying, we're naming these identities or these domains of being in a sense to be able to more effectively design for a different quality of experience in the future, right? That and inherently underneath any sort of design strategy is a desire for a quality of being, a desire for a quality of becoming, right? And that underneath life's process is a desire. So that there's a desire flowing through our work and what we're creating to move towards greater and greater ecocentric awareness and participation that affords a quality of experience that we can kind of name or feel into as more beautiful, more harmonized, generating greater potential at all these different scales of identity.
Exactly. So fundamentally, this is really this ecocentric design framework that we're alluding to, and this understanding, this way of understanding who and what we are as human beings is essentially a process relational pathway. It's a process relational framework. It's honoring the relationality that is inherent to life, and it's honoring the process of becoming that is also inherent to life. And it's basing our design frameworks on an understanding that to do good design means that we need to become clearer about who and what we are, but also what we desire. And therefore, we need to accurately kind of assess the relationships that are impacted by our current understandings of who and what we are, as well as what the process or the steps might be to include more of those relationships into the world that we're wanting to grow over time. And that allows conscious participation within the process as agents of evolution within this process. And so what meaningful domains of identity could help us be able to actually mature our understanding of ourselves? If we think of the human being often as sort of a separate self reality, what could actually help us move towards a more integrated, a more holistic understanding of who and what we are? And so we're going to talk today about really what we think of as these three foundational, irreducible categories of identity that, like we've said, have formed us and they inform us, and that their well-being is essential to our well-being. And just to name those more directly, those three categories are the unique individual self as the first, the human cultural self as the second, and the more than human ecological self as the third.
So how we understand ourselves inherently informs how we experience life, which in turn influences how we direct our creative life energy within the world. Right? So our story of identity really shapes our ontological experience, our very being of how we're interpreting life. And it also directs our creative energy within the world. What we value, it shapes what we value, which inherently directs and constrains our attention, which is essentially where we're applying our energy towards life, right? And I think this question of identity, identity is such a hot topic within society and culture at this particular moment, and I think there can be a reasonable resistance to a sense of a shared identity. But it's something that we feel like is really essential right now, that we begin to grasp some very basic, generalized, shared identities, right? That allow us to connect to who we essentially are as humans, right? In the most general, broadest sense of what that means, right? What allows humans to be, what supports our life, right? And what supports our quality of experience over time. In a sense, who am I? In a sense, who are we, right? And what are we in relationship to? And what is allowing for our being to be can therefore redirect and shape how we act and participate in the world, what we essentially value. And so I think this identifying a shared sort of story of identity, which is what we're highlighting here, right, is a framework for understanding the nature of the self, and that this can really be the foundational keystone or cornerstones for all of our collective development, technological, cultural, or otherwise, to really guide and shape our behavior in a way that aligns and attunes to what actually affords a quality of experience that we ultimately desire.
Mm-hmm. So in our process of kind of focusing in on these 3 domains of experience, we are trying, as Hayden was saying, to keep this as generalized in principle and as broad as possible, so as to be radically inclusive of all of the lived differences and all of the differences that exist within lived experience, human and otherwise. And we're also trying to be specific enough to be able to talk about differentiation across scale in a meaningful way that can actually support and encourage participation and allow the synergy between different scales of awareness to be able to create something larger than the sum of its parts. And in that process, it's trying to be able to create sort of a pathway for navigating the innate complexity of the questions of self and who and what we are in a way that kind of honors that this question of who am I is foundational to the human being and the human being's becoming. This has always been a question that we as human beings across deep time have asked and have pondered. And it's a very organic and natural question for us to grapple with at this point as well. And that there may actually be at this point an opportunity for being able to broaden and expand. And another way of saying that is to mature and include more of what we think of when we think of ourselves as human beings.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's having a sense of identity is essential, right, to being able to participate in the world. It's like to have a position, right, to have a direction, to have a sense of here I am, here we are, and this is the space we are existing in, and therefore we can act within this space with a shared understanding of what is true about the nature of reality. And so all cultures over time have had some sense of a story of what is the nature of reality? Who are we? What are we doing here? Why are we here? And that story, even though at times, like oftentimes, is naive to some extent. Like all of our stories of identity are going to be, to some extent, naive. They're going to not hold the totality of what is true about the nature of being, because that's an impossibility. But they afford a sense of a capacity to participate in the world. What happens is when we get trapped in a too limited sense or fragmented sense of identity, when we start to story ourselves, or culture starts to story itself in a way that separates itself out from essential parts of what allows it to be. For instance, if a culture separates itself out from nature, right, and sees everything around it as something that it can inherently extract and use for its own becoming without giving back, it will inherently debase its environment, its substrate that it depends on. So when it fractures off, or it fragments, or creates too narrowly defined stories of identity, when we do that at the individual level, or when we do that at the cultural level, right, we inherently generate crisis, where we begin to encounter the effects of our limited story of self in the world, right? Which is, in a sense, a kind of invitation for a maturational process. And that's essentially what crisis is. And so when we take that framework and say, okay, when we have a limited sense of ourselves, we inherently act from that limited story. Those actions create ripple effects in the world that come back to us, that reflect back to us, and maybe for a time, we're unaware that there's anything incongruent about our story of who we are, right? Things are working fine. Eventually, things start coming back and reflecting something incongruent about our story of identity, some sort of underlying fragmentation or simplification that we then encounter as a sort of crisis, something breaking open.
Exactly. And the greatest invitation of that crisis or that encounter with the previous limitations of ourself is the opportunity to actually comprehend the cause and effect and inherent interrelationality that we actually have and are with a much wider understanding of ourselves. And therefore it's an invitation for maturation to include more into how we're understanding or how we're acting in the world, so that we don't need to continually to replicate those types of actions that cause harm ultimately to ourselves as we broaden our understanding of ourselves.
Exactly.
And yet when it's not identified that that's where the crisis is arising from, then we can often try to address or react to the symptoms of the crisis rather than actually the root cause of a limited or fragmented understanding of self. And that seems to be kind of the nature of the moment that we find ourselves in today, and how we think about it and others think about it as a meta-crisis, meaning that there's a root cause that all of these kind of reactive solutions are trying to address. If it's the ecological crisis, or if it's like the financial crisis, or if it's like the medical crisis, there's something underneath all of that that is not being tended to, and we're not including enough parts of ourselves into the story of how we're designing ourselves, such that there's going to continually be this self-perpetuation of harm and crisis that unfolds until we are able to encounter more fully our true ecocentric selves, and therefore design and enact systems and whole system actions and solutions and behaviors and implementations that are including more parts of what must be included for it not to have these kind of karmic returns.
Yes, beautifully said. We're seeing continual cascading crises across multiple domains, which from our perspective is rooted in a sort of meta-level identity fragmentation that's requiring or asking us, or an invitation for us to expand our sense of self, to ask a deeper question about what are we doing here and why, and who are we, and how do we participate in a way that generates a quality of experience, not only now, but into the future, right? You can step down a level or even multiple levels to begin to have a meta conversation about the inherent fragilities or fragmentations that manifest themselves through sort of specific symptoms within the system, right? If there's a lack of realization of that, you might not even think that there's an inherent underlying issue, and then you create the Band-Aid solution, and then down the line you're going to get something worse. Getting more specific now into the identity so we can begin to work through some of the nuanced edges around how these identities relate to themselves. Naming again the three identities as the unique individual self, the cultural self, and the more than human ecological self. And that those three identities combined create the true self, or the ecocentric self, as we like to call it, right? That without those three identities, there literally is no human being. All three are essential and are woven into every single moment of our existence. Okay, so we're going to start to break that down a little bit more fully so we can begin to feel into the possibilities that arise once we start consciously working with the three identities and designing for the maximization of their quality of being and creative potential in the world.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And so these three identities, and why these are the domains that we are looking at and why we are thinking about it in this way, is that they are all they are irreducible. They cannot be fully collapsed in any one or two of the other. They each contribute to the human being's experience of being and becoming. And at the same time, they are mutually dependent, mutually informed by the other two in radical and beautiful and infinitely creative ways. We feel that it's useful to differentiate these three because there are different qualities, there's similar qualities, but there's also different qualities and different functions that exist within the three domains. And through differentiating, we're better able to actually honor and therefore design and include that facet of the human self. I just want to name that in so many ways, this is a very brief and broad introduction to these concepts, and we're grateful for you all being along with us as we put words and articulate these concepts that are very complex and very multifaceted. And we just want to acknowledge that in this first conversation around these principles, that in no way are we going to be able to fully encapsulate the totality of any one of these domains, let alone the complex interaction between the three domains. There are so many sublayers and facets and complexities and nuances and qualities within each of these three domains and across these three domains that we're excited to keep exploring and writing about and articulating and examining and having conversations about and deepening our learning about over time. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of like infinitesimal. I mean, like it's such a brief, it's not conclusive explanation, and also it's very broad at the same time. And we just want to acknowledge that and like honor our learning journey and how to put words to something that has become very clear to us and we've carried with us as a framework for several years now. But we're at this exciting moment of trying to learn how to express that which seems obvious and clear to us in a way that can be translated and communicated and built upon with other human beings.
Exactly. It reminds me of what Whitehead refers to in his book Venture of Ideas, where he's basically stating that it's the most general ideas of any age that have the most profound impacts, that guide us forward, that hold up our values and reveal to us the essence of who we are and what we're doing here. And then the process is, the work is to align with the generalized principles, with the generalized ideas, to construct reality in a way that mirrors them. And that's a multi-generational process of becoming. Once we recognize like who we are and what we value, right, we can begin to construct our realities, to construct ourselves, to construct our families and societies, and participate in a way that reflects to ever deepening degrees those inherent values, right? And to essentially strengthen the identities. So the first identity that we want to touch into is the unique self, right? This is the unique individual self. So life is experiencing itself through each of us uniquely, right? We are each experiencing life subjectively, right? That you have a quality of experience, that you have a history of experience that is unique to you. Okay, so it's like a branch of a tree experiencing life from a particular place, from a particular moment, with a particular historicity, right? From a particular angle, moving into life and experiencing life from that uniqueness.
And this unique position is an emergent relationship between all that has previously been, all that is now, and also all that might become over time. So it's an emergent experience of radical co-creation that results in a unique, irreducible, never to be repeated again expression of life as life. The unique self, in a lot of ways, is likened to a seed of possibility that is emergent based on the conditions of what has existed there, and also responsive to the possibilities that are available in the particular niche that is negotiated and navigated through relationship, and also holds within it a radical potential of what can become over time. And so the role that the unique self plays is it's always adding to and innovating and contributing to the larger ecosystem that it is a part of. Inherently, it's emerging out of that ecosystem of the two other domains of the human cultural domain, as well as the more than human ecological. And it is helping to evolve and helping to mature and helping to express the full potentiality of those contexts and conditions of which it is an inherent part.
Exactly. Like, you can think of it like unique selves are how life animates itself and participates with itself. And we're specifically talking about the human domain because we're centering ourselves back into our humanness. But life has an infinite variety of unique selves expressing the essence of life from a unique vantage point, and it's how life builds relationships. It's essentially how life participates with life itself and learns something new, explores something new, brings in novelty, fills space, right? Contributes back to the whole. And so we are each vastly complex, right? And innately capable of wildly creative possibilities, right? And wildly destructive possibilities simultaneously. And this exists within each of us. I think we each know this inherent tension and struggle, like to really grasp one's inherent agency as an individual actor within being, like, oh my gosh, like I could do so much harm. Like I could do so much harm to another, right? I could feel so much beauty. I could contribute to life and love, and there's in every single moment there are these choice points and these tensions and these struggles of being a unique individual self. And so it's not as simple as just getting the unique individual self's fundamental needs met in means of like shelter and food and water. While those things are essential for our aliveness and our being, we as unique selves, because of our complexity, because of our depth, because of our capacity, require deeper structures that support the quality of our experience, right? Because, I mean, this experience, to just be honest, can be either a nightmare, a hellish subjective experience of life, right? Or it can be this wildly ecstatic thing. And it's oftentimes an interplay between those, right? And a dialectical conversation. But one thing that we do, I think we all can grasp and realize that how we participate with life fundamentally shapes our own quality of being. But not just our own quality of being, but also impacts the quality of being for others. Like how we participate with others around us shapes their experience. And so there's something that we're safeguarding here. There's something that we're needing to tend to. There's something that we're needing to care for because of its inherent potential, both for beauty and for destruction, and because it's literally how we are each experiencing life, right? That we are here and alive in body. So if we don't care for this unique experience, which is sort of a tragedy. It's a tragic experience, the unique self, at the same time that it's a love story and it's an ecstatic experience. It's all of those things woven together. So providing a deep sense of meaning and purpose and significance for the unique self to feel like it's inherently woven into something larger than itself, that it inherently has meaning because we are, right, is essential to the wellness of our experience and the quality of our participation in the world. And that if we don't provide the conditions or develop unique selves in a way that they can feel that sense of meaning, that sense of significance, that sense of purpose, that sense of belonging, and get the basic fundamental needs met, essentially what we are generating without that is either totally chaotic experiences where individual selves start literally freaking out and acting volatilely within the world, right? Chaotically within the world, or nihilistically, right? Or literally depleting. Why would I even participate anyways, right? Mm-hmm. Life is just dull, or life is just meaningless, or all of these things that then affects our fundamental experience and participation with life, and then affects the field of relationships around us, right? So if we're not tending to, if we're not caring for, not only within ourselves, but culturally caring for the unique individual experience, just naming that as a reality of what is and the complexity of unique aliveness, and striving to tend to that quality of experience across the board. If we're not doing that, we are fundamentally harming ourselves, and we're harming our future becoming, right? We're diminishing our quality of experience, right? We're diminishing our quality of creative capacity.
And this uniqueness is something that fundamentally cannot be avoided or escaped. And so to actually turn towards and work with is the evolutionary invitation to actually honor that subjectivity and include it in both our own understanding of our own self-awareness of the particular context and ancestry and embodied experience and cultural norms and soul image and soul alignment, all of these facets of our own self-awareness, as well as the structures and the processes, which we'll talk more about in the future, that help support the soul-rooted personal development of more members of our culture, are fundamental aspects of being able to bring consciousness to this level of the individual unique self. And when more consciousness is felt within more individual unique selves, then more wholeness is possible. When more wholeness is possible, then more meaningful participation is possible, both within that domain of one's own continued holding and healing of the individual self, but also within the domains of the human cultural systems and infrastructures, as well as within the domain of radical ecological stewardship and participation and regeneration and reanimation. And so this honoring of the individual unique self and bringing consciousness to that process is really a process of being able, it's really a fundamental ingredient for being able to locate ourselves and support more of us to locate ourselves within our true nature, such that we can participate and collaboratively design more of the world, the ecocentric future world that we long for and that our hearts know is possible.
Exactly. Yeah, and that we can recognize that in the other, that we can recognize there's a unique self in the other that is other than me, right? And we can support each other in filling the niche that's ours to fill. And that there is an infinite amount of space, and what the space, all that's required is a creativity, is a bringing ourselves to the spaces of possibility that can afford creative becoming as a collaborative process between all of the unique selves, filling an ecology, creating a forest, right? Creating an ecosystem of potential, right? And of harmony over time. So this is an essential part of our 3-pillar identity, right? Like grounding in to our unique individual self, taking radical responsibility for our developmental process, supporting others and holding the weight and complexity of what it is to be a unique self, and tending to that culturally over time, so that we can be in relationship, so that we can actually experience relationship. Because without that uniqueness, without that individuality, what is relationship? How do we even have relationship?
Right, which leads us really well into the second domain or second identity. If we, in honoring the unique individual identity and filling that with conscious awareness, significance, meaning, we are then able to actually engage in relationality with those who are in that role of sacred otherness, that have a different unique experience that is inherently as valid and as equal in its lived experience and its value.
Yes.
And then from that place of shared understanding of one's uniqueness, but also the fact that there's so much that is shared, we are able to engage in the second pillar or the second domain of the human cultural self, which is its own sort of identity of exchange or domain or facet of exchange.
Right. And we both are participating in it, and we are literally grown out of it.
Yes.
Like we are literally shaped by it. Right? As much as we are creating our unique self, which is both yes and no. We are participating in our own self-becoming, which is simultaneously arising out of like a space that we are inhabiting, right, that we have been brought into. We are also shaped by, right, we are also brought into a collective field, a collective moment, right, a history, a culture that is unfolding. You can think of it like the flows of a river, right, that we are arriving inside a continuity of being, a continuity of not only more than human being, of life's evolutionary process, but a continuity of a cultural being, right? Of a shared field of relationships between humans, how we have interacted with each other, our patterns and habits of behavior, right? Are shaping our very experience of every moment. We can never be outside of the cultural dimension of being, right? It is the field we are quite literally swimming in every single moment. Like this the language that I'm speaking right now has a cultural historicity, is a cultural becoming, right? The ideas that I could even think of, even my feelings, the clothes that I'm wearing, right? I am shaped and born out of, I literally am a human being. I'm born out of other human beings, right? My very biology is shaped by our cultural process, which is literally our habits and patterns of behavior that shape biology, that recursively shape our own selves and our own capacities. And those interactions, those relationships, those exchanges is the field that I'm living in and that I'm emerging out of and that I'm participating in, right? And so the field of the cultural relationship or the cultural identity is something that I am, right? I am a cultural being. I cannot escape this identity. I can only participate from within it.
Exactly, yes. And so while there are infinite subcultures and tribal groups and kinship circles that are all part of this domain of the cultural field of relationality, the field that, or the scale that we are looking at or underscoring in this work is to honor the universal nature of our shared human cultural experience at a species level. And then we feel that it's really important in these times to remember that shared experience of our being and our becoming, and that there's a specific ancestral, intergenerational, biological, evolutionary journey that we have been with members of this species that have resulted in our being and our becoming at this phase of our development, and that there can be kind of radical more inclusivity when we're able to remember and honor that shared relatability between ourselves. Just as the unique individual self needs a context within which to have a niche and to grow out of, we really see the human cultural self at any scale of that awareness to be able to in part provide the relationality and the relationships that help give the individual a sense of being able to root and sprout and know itself in a sea of relative relatability and also relative difference that helps one know one's unique self through the sacred role of relational resonance and dissonance.
Exactly. Yeah, and what you're really bringing up here, Alia, is like none of these domains exist when in and of themselves, right? They are covalent. They are interconnected and mutually dependent for our human being to be, right? That any sense of identity, a unique self without a field of relationships, is literally pure chaos, right? Mm-hmm. You have no sense of identity. There's literally such fragmentation of otherness that you cannot ground yourself in any real reality of being. Because we have a humanness, right? We can have individual humans because we have a culture, because we have a tribe, because we have a family. We have a sense of self, right? We have a relative other that is, we both have a shared identity that we can relate to and that we can communicate and that we can exchange. And I have a unique way of participating in that field of relative similarity, right? That unique way of participating is my contribution, is the niche that I'm occupying, which is feeding back into the whole as participation in the evolutionary becoming of the whole. And so we only ever have like a relative degree of individuality, especially when we incorporate the cultural being. The cultural being is both inside of us, right? It's underlying all of our expression and experience of being. It's shaping, it's a lens in which we can never fully take off because we're so immersed within it that the layers of the unconscious and the subconscious are wrapped up and dependent on this cultural process, this cultural relational field, that it informs our very identity. It informs our very self. So it's on the deepest level, it's inside of us, right? And it's also outside. It also transcends and is beyond the individual self. It's the relationships that we interact with. It's our habits and customs. It's also the structures of our society, the institutions that we create, which support our trans-temporal journey. We create those, and those structures survive beyond my individual sense of self, right? They live beyond, they live over multiple generations as a process of supporting the continual regeneration of human being itself, right? And so that, in a sense, is like, wow, okay, at the cultural level of identity, I have a continuity of being that exists beyond my individual life, that I have like a sense of a symbolic existence that goes way back in time, way back in time, that's connected in this ancestral process and this cultural process that is birthing me into this moment now, and then it will exist beyond me as long as humans continue to become. And that's actually part of our task as individual agents, is to tend to the cultural domain, to safeguard the continual becoming of human being into the future, right? And we'll include the third identity. If anyone's like, well, anthropocentric triggers going off by saying that, it's like, yes, if that were it, right? If that's what the culture only knew, only knew how to propagate its own self, and it had no other larger sense of self, right? It would inherently undermine its own well-being, right? And this is the really important, crucial part of our framework here, is that the cultural self is in service to something greater than itself. Just like the individual self is in service to something greater. The cultural self is, yes, in service to all of the individual selves and their well-being, because all of those individual selves are propagating and continuing the cultural self and laying the foundations for the future generations. But the cultural self is also fundamentally in service to that which supports life itself, which is the conditions and the container and the context from which we exist and that we source our life, right? And so if a cultural self is not attending to that domain, is not supporting what we're now going to introduce as the third identity, which is the more than human self, then it is undermining its own being, its own well-being, because the cultural self has a framework of reference of existing in time that is beyond the individual unique self. And so the cultural self more deeply cares, or we could say even should more deeply care, about continuity of being and quality of experience over deep time. And so it's essential that the cultural self integrates the more than human ecological self in order to support the ongoing thriving of the conditions that allow for continual regeneration.
Yes, exactly. And if and when a culture does not do that or hold that in mind, or has an inherently limited understanding of itself that does not include the third pillar of the more than human ecological self, that will, as we've talked about previously, be it will be self-encountered. It will be turned back on itself. There will be ecological crisis. There will be ways that the ecological self is making itself known, either within the individual bodies through disease and environmental toxicity or autoimmune conditions, or it will be revealed through cascading ecological crises of different sorts, which is the case in our moment now, as we have in many ways forgotten or ignored or not remembered that the human cultural self and the individuals who are part of that must essentially be in service to that more than human ecology that informs and sources and sustains all life, human and otherwise.
Exactly. I think I just want to mention one more thing here about the cultural self before we move on. In a sense, like, we're using that term very broadly, right? The culture as the habits of relationship, the patterns and structures that support the continuity of being for human beings, the continual regeneration, the growth and development, and our exchange between each other. Culture literally means to cultivate the conditions that allow for ripeness of life to grow. And so there's a multiplicity of expressions of culture, and we even include economics, governance structures, education, art, all of these things, like the food that we eat, right, are expressions of culture that are really rooted in this desire to continue to create foundations for a quality of experience and a continuation of experience to be, and a health of experience, a vibrancy, a space for people to participate in the ongoing generation of human beings.
Yes, exactly. And as social animals and social beings, like when two or more of us are together, there is a cultural, relational experience that's taking place that is supporting, co-regulation at the basic level, or co-escalation on the other side of that, but that there is a third or a synergy between two or more that creates a field of relationality that is essential and impacts essentially our individual experience, as well as the impact on the ecological or the more than human experience.
Yes, exactly. So now we're going to get into the more than human ecological self, right, which is the third identity. So this domain is incredibly vast, right? It is so expansive that even an adequate description of its nature and particularities is almost an impossibility, okay? So I just want to name that. We're now entering into the domain of the more than human, right? So it's like what fundamentally informs our being, and that's beyond us, right? That if humans disappeared from the earth, what still remains, right? What still is there? And so the simplest way to define this is called the more than human ecological self, right? Which is the field of relationships that are generating life itself, and all of the multiplicity of expressions of being that are creating the conditions, the context for all of life's expressions to be, and for us to be, right? A simple way of describing this is like we are literally breathing air right now. I'm walking through space that's inhabited by particles and electrons. I am infused with energy that's permeating through the universe and the light from the sun itself, and I'm drinking the water of the earth, and so I'm literally held up and held within and taking in, permeated by, grown out of this more than human ecological self. And so essentially, the health and foundation of the more than human ecological self determines my health and well-being, right? That if the ecological, more than human, collapsed, if we destroyed the essence of life, we destroy ourselves fundamentally. So how we participate within this domain, the health of our context, the health of our environment, the health of the foundations of life determine our own being, our own wellness, our own becoming.
Yes, exactly. So just to underscore and reflect on the fact that this acknowledgement of this third domain of self, the more than human, ecological, is fundamentally an acknowledgement that we are life, we are earth, we are ecology in human form, that we are informed by and we are participating with life and earth in many different, infinitely different forms around ourselves. And so the health and well-being of all that which we breathe in, we take in, we eat, we source ourselves, we interact with, the health and well-being of that as us, that we are nothing but that we are nothing but the universe, the cosmos, the earth, the planet, the ecosystem in human form, interacting with itself, with themselves across time, means that this is a foundational aspect of our identity, of ourselves, of what sustains and allows this conscious experience, this experience of living, of aliveness to be occurring at all, and therefore is of great importance for us at individual levels and cultural levels to steward, to reanimate, to honor, to center, to incorporate, to become curious about, to work with, to collaborate with, to open to be informed by in radically creative and innovative ways that aligns with a greater sense of partnership between all that is seen and unseen, that is micro and macro, about our experience of more than what is just in the separate understanding of the individual, of more than what is included when we take human out of the context of life and we separate it in some way. We actually have so much less access to brilliance, to ingenuity, to inspiration, that we can't actually do that. We can't separate, but when we try to, we isolate ourselves off, we cut ourselves off, we don't allow ourselves to be informed by all that is the evolutionary impulse that has grown us and that will be our pathway towards being able to participate and survive and thrive through this evolutionary process of becoming.
Absolutely. This is such a beautiful identity to grasp, right? That we are this. Like it's and yes, it's outside of us too. It's like it's beyond me. Right? It's like, but I am this. I am the emergent evolutionary process coalescing into an individual experience that's living in a human body, that's shaped by a cultural context, that's experiencing life in a unique way, and that is born out of billions of years of an evolutionary process and held up by an infinitely complex web of relationships that are affording a quality of being that allows for this experience to exist at all is just such an incredible miracle that we can then feel life. We can then see and taste, right? Like ourselves around us, right? In this field of relationships that we are embedded within. And that sense of aloneness can dissipate into this sense of infinite relationality. And within that is all of our hopes and dreams of some sort of transcendent realization that we oftentimes place on the individual egoic self, seeking some sense of immortality. The more than human identity is the immortal identity. It is the field of evolutionary relationships, the processes of generation that exist and permeate all of being and becoming, right? And that there is literally nothing that we can do to stop or to destroy that foundational evolutionary process. And that we are literally woven into that and can never separate ourselves from it. So when we begin to recognize that, we can We can breathe into this really deep, really rich process of being and becoming, and tend to the continual evolutionary conditions for a quality of creative being and expression that affords like infinite creative capacity within the more than human dimension over time, right? That everything that is an expression of life right now is participating with life, and that our experience, my experience, your experience, the delicacy of it, right? What we can feel, what we can sense, what we can hear, what we can taste, what we can experience is held up by this wildly beautiful, nuanced, complex arrangement of collaboration, of harmony. And that we get to tend to that space too. And then what can continue to arise from within that environment when we begin to see ourselves as fundamentally in service to its evolutionary becoming. This domain or identity can change everything for us as human beings when we begin to integrate it with the other two. And that oftentimes we've made the mistake culturally, collectively, individually of reducing our experience down to one or two of these dimensions and forgetting about the intricate dynamic interplay between the three of them. Me as an agentic individual self gets to participate with the more than human. I get to actively tend to this larger field of identity that's informing me and animating me, giving me life so that I can participate with myself in these really beautiful ways. And that we culturally have so much capacity to move these levers, to shape the nature of reality, right? To change our environments. And then when we can remember what we're culturally here for, and what can be possible when we tend to these dimensions of our being, the potential becomes infinite, and the experience of ecstatic joy can begin to permeate through our being, and we can remember a sense of meaning and significance and purpose again.
Yes, exactly. And that process of honoring all of those three interlocking, interrelated facets or domains of ourselves is really what we think of as this kind of ecocentric self, the eco being home. It really is a homecoming when we remember and when we arrive into the shared understanding and even personal understanding of these three interrelated facets of who we are. We arrive home into a larger understanding of ourselves, a more accurate understanding of who and what we truly are, and all that truly is informing and has shaped, and that we are in relationship with over time. And so it's a homecoming process, and it's also an invigorating and an activating and a catalyzing process. The triplicity really is a sort of it's like the delta symbol of change. The triplicity in so many traditions is understood to be a number three of implementation on the material plane, that things can happen and occur when three come together in any type of way. And so this honoring of these three domains of ourselves and the triplicity of ourselves allows an activation, a catalytic initiation of more evolutionary movement and engagement and participation in the growing of this home that is us and is our true nature, us being the totality of all that is. And so it's both an arrival into something that is just inherently true, that is real, is true, is what is, regardless of our consciousness about it, and at the same time, given the extraordinary capacities of our prefrontal cortex as human beings, we do get to participate in this story, in this process. We do actually get to consciously co-create this homecoming, this homemaking, this home building process of an ecocentric future world, and the growing of ecocentric self-identity over time.
Yes, so beautiful, so beautiful. And it just was, as you were speaking, I was feeling the sense of like enlightenment in this context. It's a realization of our invitation for participation over time, right? And that as we participate, as we align, as we remember ourselves as a unique self, fully occupy our unique niche, and participate in the relational field of our cultural being, our cultural domain grows and strengthens, and itself becomes more enlightened, becomes more conscious of itself, able to participate with itself in more beautiful and nuanced ways over time, creating conditions and environments for individual experiences beyond what we can imagine at this point, because we are in a moment where we are not consciously tending, actively caring for these domains of our identity. And if we were, the potential of what life can be, of what experience can be, is so beyond our imaginings, but we can feel it. It's not about inhabiting all of that right now, right here for myself. It's about humbly tending to the soil, tending to the conditions that can support that eventuality, right? That possibility. Not the guarantee. We can't guarantee anything in life, but we can tend to the possibility. And through doing so, we can feel ourselves intimately woven into and a part of, meaningfully a part of, its becoming. Right? And that we can feel ourselves as like, okay, however we are participating now, whatever conditions we're creating for the future, my cultural self is going to be experiencing those conditions in the future. And my more than human self is going to be experiencing those conditions in the future. So how do we want to be? How do we want to feel? That's this real deep invitation that we're holding at seeds, which is an image of possibility born out of the past, which can be planted, intended, and grown into being. And so in the coming episodes, we are going to be highlighting specific modalities, which are ways of being, ways of tending, ways of developing within these three identity categories.
Now that we have named and explored together these primary identities, these primary domains, we're excited to share in upcoming episodes about the practices and modalities and approaches that can support development within and across these three domains of our essential self. And we hope that this conversation offers a bit more specificity or illumination on this process relational story of identity that is built upon a more complex, integrative, and inclusive understanding of who and what we are as human beings and who and what we are as life itself. We hope that being able to remember and claim these three primary facets of our identity can help us create a bit more meta-stability from which to weather and navigate this meta-crisis in order to actually incorporate and mature and develop a wholer, fuller, more complex, more nuanced, more inclusive understanding of who and what we are that can actually serve who and what we can become.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you got this far, we really appreciate you taking the time to soak in this information. It's a process for us and to create this content. And we have also have an article. So if you want to read more about this, sink more into it, check that out on our Substack. where this podcast will also be listed. And join us in this journey as we continue to explore these ideas and seek to apply them in praxis. It's part of our main vision of creating hubs of ecocentric evolution where we can play with design with each other, of birthing these future possibilities together. So if that interests you, please reach out and start the conversation. We would love that. We would love to connect with you in any way.
Yes, we certainly would. So much love. Be well. Take care. Bye-bye.